Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into the Concise History of the Crusades by Thomas F. Madden.
Yes. A really significant work. It tackles a subject many people think they know, but as Madden argues, it's still, well, widely misunderstood, even after decades of really rich scholarly work.
And that's exactly our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack this complex, sometimes really controversial period, moving beyond the common myths, the popular ideas, to understand the Crusades through the lens of, modern scholarship, which is exactly what Madden's book aims to do.
Precisely. He makes I think, a very compelling case that much of how we view the Crusades today is filtered through these much later perspectives.
Right, like the Enlightenment's view or 19th century Romanticism, even, as he points out, post-9/11 interpretations.
Perspectives that are just profoundly different from the medieval mindset that actually shaped these events.
So the challenge is understanding them as they were lived, as they were understood then, not how we imagine them now with our often very secular assumptions.
Exactly. And Madden's book, which is built on just extensive research, really tries to strip away those layers of later interpretation to get at that medieval reality. It's not easy.
So our aim is to explore the Crusades, not just as, say, those famous dramatic expeditions to the east which tend to dominate the popular view, but as a much broader, more dynamic, really long-lasting movement.
A movement that was deeply intertwined with and profoundly shaped both Europe and the Middle East, driven by, well, a complex mix of things. Deep religious faith, absolutely, but also shifting politics, economic factors, and, yeah, sometimes surprising interactions between cultures.
We'll definitely get into the diverse motivations of the people who took the cross,
Mhm.
because it wasn't, a single group with one goal. Far from it.
And we'll look at how the crusading movement took many forms beyond those initial Eastern campaigns, conflicts much closer to home, right there in Europe.
And critically, we need to trace how the understanding and memory of the Crusades have been reinterpreted, reshaped over centuries, right up to how they're talked about and perceived today. It's history, but it's also the history of how we remember, or maybe misremember, that history.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's set the stage. To understand the Crusades, Madden really insists we have to grasp the world they came from, especially that medieval mindset.
This is absolutely fundamental. Madden stresses this point again and again. The medieval understanding of life, the world, the role of religion in it, it was just drastically different from ours.
Totally. We live in a world where, motivations for conflict are usually framed politically, economically, democracy, nationalism, resources.
Right. But for medieval people, religious belief wasn't just a private thing. It was the organizing principle of their whole existence. And fighting for Christ, defending the faith, this was a powerful, deeply meaningful motivation. It could promise eternal salvation.
It's hard for us to truly wrap our heads around that today, isn't it? The idea of marching across a continent, facing unbelievable hardship, disease, likely death, primarily for a spiritual reward.
It really is. We might understand fighting for a nation state, maybe an ideology, but for them, fighting for Christ in the Holy Land offered something, well, far greater in their worldview. Penance, forgiveness of sins, guaranteed entry into paradise if they died. That's a powerful pull.
So this idea of Christians engaging with war, it had its own development before the Crusades.
Oh, definitely. Early Christian thinkers like Augustine back in the 4th, 5th centuries wrestled with it. He developed the just war concept. War could be a necessary evil, permitted by God, but only under really strict conditions.
Like defense or recovering property, punishing wrongs, and only by a legitimate authority with the right intentions.
Exactly, but it wasn't seen as inherently good or something the church should actively promote for expansion or conversion. It was more like a grim necessity for rulers sometimes.
Okay, so that's the Christian context evolving. But then, in the 7th century, you have the emergence of Islam, a very different relationship to warfare and expansion from the start.
Well, the source notes that Islam, from its very beginning, integrated political and religious leadership in Muhammad himself. So practices like commerce, justice, diplomacy, and yes, warfare were sort of embedded in the faith's fabric.
And the concept of jihad.
Central, meaning struggle. Now, it includes spiritual struggle, self-improvement, but armed struggle for the defense or expansion of Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, was also a significant aspect. And crucially, dying in such a jihad meant martyrdom, immediate entry into paradise. A very powerful spiritual incentive right from the outset.
So a direct spiritual reward for military action, maybe more explicit early on than in Christianity at that time. And who were the targets?
Yes, the source clarifies this. Armed jihad was mainly against unbelievers actively hindering Islam or refusing submission, but it distinguished people of the book, Jews and Christians.
Because they worshiped the same God, just differently in the Muslim view.
Right. They weren't pagans. They could be tolerated within Muslim lands, keep their faith, pay a special tax, the jizya, and accept Muslim political rule. Generally not targets for forced conversion, though they faced discrimination and could be persecuted if seen as hostile.
And this Islamic worldview divided the world.
Into Dar al-Islam, the lands under Muslim rule, and Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, lands of unbelievers.
Implying conflict.
Well, the traditional understanding, though debated, was that Dar al-Harb was in a state of potential or actual conflict with Dar al-Islam, the long-term goal being the expansion of Dar al-Islam to cover the world. This provided a theological basis for, well, ongoing expansion and conflict with non-Muslim neighbors.
And the most significant non-Muslim neighbor for centuries was the Byzantine Empire.
Absolutely. The Eastern Roman Empire. They'd already faced centuries of Islamic expansion but had held on to their core territories, especially the vital region of Asia Minor, modern Turkey.
Vital.
Incredibly important. Source of food, manpower for the armies. Control of Asia Minor was essential for Constantinople's survival. But then, in the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks arrived.
Not Arabs, these were Turkic people who converted to Sunni Islam.
Yes, and they built a huge empire. They conquered areas previously under Arab Muslim rule, like Syria and Palestine, and then pushed hard into Byzantine Asia Minor. Constant raids, taking territory.
Which led to a pivotal moment, a real catastrophe for Byzantium, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071.
Manzikert was devastating. The Seljuks, under Alp Arslan, crushed the Byzantine field army and captured the emperor Romanus IV. Even though he was released later, Byzantine military power in Asia Minor was broken. Civil wars followed, preventing effective resistance. Within years, most of Asia Minor was open to Turkish settlement.
That must have felt like the end of the world in Constantinople.
It really did. The Turks were suddenly dangerously close. People genuinely feared the end of the Roman Empire, this thousand-year institution. Plus, they faced threats from Normans in Italy and pagan tribes in the Balkans. A desperate situation.
And into this steps Emperor Alexius Comnenus in 1081.
A very capable leader. He worked tirelessly to restore things, rebuild the army, often using mercenaries. But he knew he needed more help, more soldiers than Byzantium could quickly muster. So he cautiously looked west.
Which was a big deal, right? Given the schism of 1054 and the general Byzantine view of Westerners.
Very big deal. Byzantines often saw Western Europeans as culturally inferior, maybe even heretical barbarians under the Pope's sway. But Alexius was pragmatic. He needed troops. He sent envoys asking for mercenaries to help fight the Turks in Asia Minor.
And this appeal, or maybe the Pope's interpretation of it, leads us to Pope Urban II and the call for the First Crusade in 1095. The book mentions this wasn't entirely out of the blue.
That's right. Urban's predecessor, Gregory II, had considered an expedition to aid Byzantium earlier, framed as mercy, charity for Eastern Christians. But the investiture controversy, his big fight with Emperor Henry IV, sidelined that plan.
But Urban picked it up, and his sermon at Clermont in November 1095. It transformed the whole idea, didn't it?
Dramatically. This is the key moment Madden highlights. Urban didn't just talk about helping Byzantium. He broadened the goal massively. The liberation of Jerusalem and the lands of Christ from Turkish Seljuk occupation. Suddenly, helping Byzantium was just a step along the way.
Jerusalem. Its significance for medieval Christians. It's hard to overstate.
Immense. Site of the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ultimate pilgrimage destination. Seen literally as the center of the universe. Now, its capture by Muslims back in the 7th century was a scandal, but pilgrims had mostly been able to visit. But under the Seljuks, new reports surfaced. Harassment of pilgrims, damage to holy sites. Urban seized on these reports.
So the motivations preached weren't about forced conversion.
No, not primarily. The core motivations were deeply spiritual, penitential. Taking the cross was preached as an act of charity, a holy pilgrimage, a way to do penance for sins, gain spiritual merit, and that promise of salvation, especially if you died defending Christ's lands, hugely powerful in an age intensely aware of sin and the afterlife.
And the response was massive, and not just from knights.
That's key. Because it was framed as a pilgrimage for salvation, it resonated everywhere. Women, the elderly, the poor, the sick. They also wanted to take the cross. They saw it as their path to heaven. The Pope tried to restrict it to fighters, but the popular view was different, which helps explain things like the People's Crusade.
Ah, yeah, the sort of spontaneous, disorganized wave that went first.
Exactly. Led by figures like Peter the Hermit, Walter Saint-Sauveur, masses of ordinary people fired up with piety, expecting miracles. They reached Constantinople way ahead of the main armies in 1096. Alexius advised them to wait.
But they were restless, eager for glory, maybe, and probably running out of food.
Definitely practical problems. They started pillaging the suburbs for supplies. Alexius, probably seeing them as more trouble than they were worth, helped them cross into Asia Minor. The result? Predictable disaster. They were quickly wiped out by the Turks. A tragic start.
The main Crusader army, arriving later, was different, led by major nobles.
Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, experienced warriors leading separate armies. But they still faced immense challenges crossing Asia Minor. Disease, starvation, constant fighting.
And the Siege of Antioch, 1097, 1098, sounds like a real ordeal.
Incredibly long 8 months. Terrible suffering. And this is where internal rivalries really flared up. Bohemond clearly wanted Antioch for himself. Raymond of Toulouse insisted they keep their oath to Alexius and push on to Jerusalem.
So political ambition versus the pilgrimage goal.
Absolutely. They eventually took Antioch, partly through Bohemond arranging a way in, but then, boom, they're besieged themselves by a massive Muslim relief army under Kerboga. Trapped, starving, situation desperate.
And this is where the Holy Land story comes in.
Yes. Amidst the despair, a vision leads to the discovery of what they believed was the lance that pierced Christ's side. Genuine or not, the psychological impact was huge. Morale soared. Believing God was with them, they charged out and somehow smashed Kerboga's much larger army.
A miracle, from their perspective.
Totally. Proof of God's direct intervention. But after the victory, the argument over Antioch stalled things for months. Bohemond got the city. Raymond, focused on Jerusalem, finally led a large contingent south in early 1099.
And the march south was easier.
Initially, yes. Smaller local emirs often just kidded them to move on. The bigger Turkish powers were busy fighting each other. And crucially, the Fatimids of Egypt, who were Shiite, had recently recaptured Jerusalem from the Sunni Seljuks.
And the book says the Fatimids didn't really get what the Crusaders were about.
Seems so. They saw the Franks maybe as just another Western force stirring up trouble for their rivals, the Seljuks. They even offered alliances if the Franks stayed out of Fatimid Palestine. But the Franks didn't really distinguish Muslims were Muslims holding the Holy Land. They ignored the offers.
And finally, June 1099, they reached Jerusalem.
The culmination, years of hardship. Imagine the emotion. Welcomed in Bethlehem, saw a lunar eclipse, took it as a sign. Then reaching Montjoy, that hill, seeing the city for the first time, the goal.
The siege and capture in July 1099.
Okay.
Famous, controversial.
Brutal, no question. But the source tackles the myths. Estimates are maybe 4,000, 5,000 killed during and right after the assault, but many others survived. Some bought their freedom, others were expelled. That later image of, rivers of blood, Madden dismisses it as medieval hyperbole, physically impossible.
So violent, but not the absolute indiscriminate slaughter sometimes pictured.
Not quite. And for the Crusaders, this wasn't about their military genius, it was God's work. They'd suffered, faced impossible odds, yet here they were. They prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, thanking God for the miracle.
Yeah, they had to govern it, defend it.
Needed a ruler. Raymond of Toulouse was the most powerful, held the citadel, but he famously refused the title of king. Said he wouldn't wear a gold crown where Christ wore thorns.
Pious. Or maybe political calculation.
Well, possibly both. Maybe he expected them to insist. But they didn't. They turned to Godfrey of Bouillon, popular with the ordinary soldiers. He also refused king, but accepted rule as protector of the Holy Sepulchre.
Raymond must have been furious.
He was. Held on to the citadel for a bit, eventually left, angry. But he did come back soon after, for the crucial Battle of Ascalon. They defeated a big Fatimid army trying to retake Jerusalem. That victory really cemented the Crusader state's initial hold.
And the success of this First Crusade inspired another wave. The Crusade of 1101.
Yeah, the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted, sometimes called. People who'd taken the vow but hadn't gone or had deserted. The Pope pressured them. Spurred by the news from Jerusalem, they went east expecting miracles.
But it didn't work out like the first time.
No, the element of surprise was gone. The Muslim world, still divided, were starting to react. The 1101 Crusaders suffered heavy losses, mostly failed, a reminder that divine favor wasn't automatic. It depended, contemporaries thought, on the Crusaders' piety and commitment.
Okay, so the Crusader states are established: Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, Edessa. What was life like? What about Byzantium? That relationship stayed tricky, right?
Very tricky. Bohemond keeping Antioch really poisoned things. He eventually went back to Europe, raised an army, and actually invaded the Byzantine Empire in 1107.
Like his father had tried.
Exactly. But Alexius, I was ready this time. Bohemond was defeated, forced into the humiliating Treaty of Devil, accepting vassalage for Antioch. He never returned east. That mistrust between Franks and Byzantines just lingered.
And the Crusader states themselves. Constant pressure.
Always. Internal squabbles among the Frankish lords were common, and constant external threats from Muslim neighbors who were gradually getting more organized. Leaders got captured, like King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, held prisoner for over a year.
Madden also brings up this fascinating angle of cultural exchange, using the Arab observer Usama ibn Munkud.
Usama's memoirs are incredible, a window into the time. He talks about Franks who'd lived in the East a long time, becoming quite Orientalized, adopting local customs, owning property Eastern style, even intermarrying with local Christians, Armenians, sometimes baptized Muslims, learning languages, building relationships. It suggests a level of interaction beyond just constant war.
Though Usama was also critical of Frankish culture, especially regarding women.
Oh, yes. He was shocked by what he saw as their lack of honor or jealousy. Frankish women interacting freely with men not their husbands, completely alien to his conservative Muslim view, shows that even with interaction, deep cultural divides remained.
And the need for defense led to the military orders, the Templars.
Absolutely crucial. Founded around 1188-1119, initially just a few knights protecting pilgrims going to Jerusalem, King Baldwin II gave them quarters on the Temple Mount, hence their name.
And Bernard of Clairvaux gave them a huge boost.
Bernard, maybe the most influential man in Europe, championed them. Wrote about a new chivalry fighting for God, gaining salvation through arms, huge prestige, donations, recruits poured in. They became powerful international bodies building massive castles.
And they got into banking. Seems odd for warrior monks.
It does, but it was practical. They developed systems for people to deposit money in Europe and withdraw in the East, became incredibly sophisticated financiers. Immense power, which eventually caused problems for them back in Europe. But in the 12th, 13th centuries, they, along with the Hospitallers and later Teutonic Knights, were vital military pillars for the Crusader states.
While the Franks were consolidating, Muslim power started to regroup. Zengi is a key figure here.
Zengi, a Turkish warlord, ruthless, effective, started unifying parts of Syria and Iraq. His capture of Edessa in 1144 was a huge shock to the West, the first major Christian territory lost. That directly triggered the Second Crusade. Though it's worth noting, Zengi spent a lot of time fighting other Muslims, especially trying to get Damascus.
Which led to some strange alliances.
Exactly. Madden points out that Christian Jerusalem under King Fulk actually allied with Muslim Damascus against Zengi. They saw Zengi's expansion as the bigger immediate threat. Shows the politics weren't always purely religious.
Zengi's son, Nur ed-Din, continued his work.
Nur ed-Din kept unifying Muslim territories, and the source suggests he had a sort of spiritual awakening, intensifying his focus on jihad against the Franks. He used jihad propaganda skillfully for political unity, but seems to have genuinely believed in it too.
He sounds a bit like Bernard of Clairvaux on the Muslim side, emphasizing unity and piety for success.
That's a really interesting parallel. Nur ed-Din stressed unity, built mosques, schools, promoted justice, presented himself as the pious defender of Islam, and he made recapturing Jerusalem a central theme, even commissioning a pulpit for the Al-Aqsa Mosque years before he got anywhere near the city. Shows Jerusalem becoming the symbolic focus for the counter-crusade.
So, Edessa falls, Nur ed-Din rises, leading to the Second Crusade, 1147-1149.
Called by Pope Eugenius III, his papal bull, Quantum Predecessors, became a template, recalled the First Crusade's glory, offered the full indulgence, standardized privileges like property protection, debt suspension. Very organized call.
Eugenius apparently didn't initially want the German Emperor Conrad III involved.
Right, maybe worried about imperial power or needed him in Italy, but Bernard of Clairvaux's involvement changed that. Bernard was hesitant at first, maybe remembering 1101's failure, but once persuaded, he threw his immense prestige behind it.
And he preached it as more than just war, right? As redemption.
Powerful stuff. He framed it as a way for knights, often violent men, to channel their skills for God, earn salvation. Said Christ was offering this unique chance. Bernard was utterly convinced God would grant victory if it was done piously.
And the goal wasn't just Jerusalem this time, since it was still Christian-held. The idea broadened.
Yes. responding to Edessa but also other frontiers. Bernard also, importantly, spoke out against attacking Jews during this time, saw them as witnesses to Scripture, needing protection until their prophesied conversion.
And he persuaded Emperor Conrad to join.
Famously, yes, a dramatic appeal during Mass, reminding Conrad of all God's gifts to him, asking what he'd done in return. Conrad apparently broke down, took the cross. Huge impact.
This broadening concept also led to the Wendish Crusade in 1147.
Right. Saxon nobles fighting pagan Slavs, Wends, east of the Elbe, asked if they could fulfill their vows fighting there instead of going east. Bernard agreed, got papal approval. Same spiritual rewards, but the goal here was explicitly conversion by the sword. No peace unless they accept baptism. Shows the Crusade model being applied within Europe for conquest and conversion.
So a multi-front effort. But the main expedition to the east, it failed badly.
Both Conrad's Germans and Louis VII French suffered heavy losses marching through Byzantine lands. Byzantines were wary, unhelpful, sometimes hostile, supplies, skirmishes, a bad start.
And then a questionable strategic decision in the Holy Land.
Instead of hitting Nur ed-Din's power base in Aleppo, they attacked Damascus in 1148. Damascus had often been Jerusalem's ally against Nur ed-Din. Alienated Damascus, alienated the Byzantines. The siege was a complete fiasco, collapsed after just 4 days. Humiliating.
The kings went home empty-handed. Bernard, who'd promised victory, had to explain this.
He was devastated, but didn't back down theologically. He looked to the Old Testament. God withheld victory not because the cause was wrong, but because of the sins of the Crusaders, of Europe. It was a divine punishment, a call for purification. The fault lay with the people, not God or the preachers. Maintained the Crusade idea, but put the onus on the Crusaders' moral state.
Okay, that brings us towards the end of the 12th century, and the figure who really dominates the Western image of this period, Saladin.
Saladin. Kurdish background, nephew of one of Nur ed-Din's generals, rose through the ranks in Egypt, eventually took power there, ended the Fatimid Caliphate, restored Sunni rule. After Nur ed-Din died, Saladin moved to unite Egypt and Syria, defeating rivals, founding the Ayyubid dynasty.
And like Nur ed-Din, he apparently had a personal shift towards focusing on jihad.
The sources suggest experiences like surviving assassination attempts, illness, deepened his religious focus. And he picked up Nur ed-Din's theme, making the reconquest of Jerusalem the absolute centerpiece, the symbol of his holy war. A shift from earlier Muslim indifference after 1099. He aimed to drive the Franks out completely.
While Saladin united Muslim power, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was tearing itself apart.
Yes, chronic infighting in the 1180s. Factions around the young leper king, Baldwin IV, and Guy of Lusignan versus rivals like Raymond of Tripoli. These feuds paralyzed the kingdom, made it vulnerable. Saladin watched it happen,
Leading directly to the absolute disaster at the Horns of Hattin in 1187.
arguably the kingdom's single greatest defeat. Terrible strategic mistakes by the Frankish leaders, trapped without water in the heat, facing Saladin's brilliant tactics. The Christian field army was essentially annihilated. Most fighting men lost, the True Cross captured, nobles killed or captured. Catastrophic.
And the kingdom just collapsed afterwards.
Pretty much. With no army left, Saladin swept through. Cities fell like dominoes. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon. Decades of defense building crumbled in months.
And finally, Jerusalem itself, October 1187.
The source details this carefully. Saladin initially threatened a massacre, but Balian of Ibelin, commanding the defense, made a counter-threat. Destroy the Muslim holy sites on the Temple Mount, kill the Muslim inhabitants if no terms were offered. Saladin relented.
So he agreed to let them leave?
Yes, Christians could buy their freedom and leave safely. Some couldn't afford it, were enslaved, but thousands left. Compared to 1099, much less violent, though still traumatic. This relative clemency really boosted Saladin's chivalrous reputation in the West later on.
News of Hattin and Jerusalem's fall. Shockwaves across Europe.
Immense shock, grief, outrage, a sign of God's anger. Pope Urban III supposedly died of grief. Gregory VIII issued the bull. Audita Tremendi became the model crusade call, lamented the disaster, blamed Christian sins, called for fasting prayer, a 7-year truce in Europe for a new crusade.
The Third Crusade, the big one with the 3 great kings.
Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II, Augustus of France, Richard I, the Lionheart of England. Unprecedented royal power involved.
Barbarossa went overland first, largest army.
Huge army, but difficult march. Trouble with the Byzantines again. Emperor Isaac II was hindering them, maybe even talking to Saladin. Frederick had to capture Adrianople to force cooperation, then the tragedy. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Asia Minor in 1190. His army mostly fell apart after that. A huge blow.
Philip and Richard arrived later, by sea, joined the siege of Acre.
Acre had been under siege since 1189 by Guy of Lusignan. A bold move by Guy, rallying Crusaders to him, became a long, brutal 2-year stalemate.
The arrival of the English and French kings tipped the balance.
Definitely. More troops, siege engines, naval power. Acre finally surrendered to Richard and Philip in July 1191. Terms agreed. Saladin to return the true cross, pay a huge ransom, release prisoners.
But Richard then executed the Muslim garrison.
Yes. Saladin was late with the first payment. Richard ordered about 2,700 prisoners executed in sight of Saladin's army. A brutal message. Shattered trust, ended the deal. Hugely controversial then and now.
Philip went home soon after, leaving Richard in command. His campaign down the coast, militarily brilliant.
Richard was a superb commander. New Saladin held the interior, so he stuck to the coast, supplied by his fleet. Strict discipline marching south to Jaffa. Saladin's cavalry harassed them constantly, trying to lure knights out of formation. Richard held them together. Even Saladin's biographer admired his skill.
Richard also tried some weird diplomacy, marrying his sister to Saladin's brother.
Bizarre, yeah. Proposed his sister Joan marry Saif al-Din. They'd rule a buffer state together. Saladin was maybe intrigued, but Richard insisted Saif al-Din convert. Deal off. Meanwhile, Saladin was also talking to Richard's rival, Conrad of Montferrat. Politics never stopped.
But the ultimate goal, Jerusalem, remained out of reach.
The march was slow. Richard kept stopping to rebuild coastal forts, secure supply lines. They got close. Beit Nuba, just 12 miles away, January 1192. Morale high despite the bad weather.
But a strategic dead end.
A huge dilemma. Jerusalem was heavily garrisoned, wells poisoned, an assault was risky, and even if they took it, how could it hold it? Saladin's army was intact nearby, could cut them off from the coast, they'd be trapped.
So another council, another hard decision.
Richard convened the leaders. He argued the real key was Egypt, Saladin's power base. Attacking Egypt was smarter long-term than taking a city they couldn't hold. The council agreed. Attacking Jerusalem was too risky, unsustainable.
Strategically logical, but must have been deeply disappointing.
Absolutely. Then Richard got sick, got bad news from home, his brother John and Philip conspiring. He knew he couldn't take and hold Jerusalem now. So he negotiated a 3-year truce with Saladin, September 1192.
What were the terms?
Christians kept control of the coastal strip, and crucially, unarmed Christian pilgrims got free, safe access to holy sites, including Jerusalem. The city stayed Muslim, but pilgrims could visit. Richard then sailed home, got captured in Austria. Another story. So the Third Crusade saved the coastal states, got access for pilgrims, but failed to retake Jerusalem.
Which leads us to the Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204, and the infamous diversion to Constantinople. Pope Innocent III launched this one.
Innocent III became Pope 1198. Young, dynamic, powerful. Reconquering Jerusalem was central to his papacy, his heart's desire, planned a massive effort, mobilizing all Christendom prayer, fasting, finance, even a clerical tax.
But again, couldn't get the big kings involved. Wars, disputes.
Right. So they had to recruit nobles, contract transport. They went to Venice, made a deal for ships and supplies for a huge army, 33,500 men. Huge cost to be paid by Crusaders arriving in Venice.
And that's where it went wrong immediately.
Big time. Only about 11,000 showed up by summer 1202. Nowhere near enough to pay the bill. They could only raise about a third. Huge problem for the Crusaders needing ships. Huge problem for Venice, who'd invested massively. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, couldn't just let it go.
So Dandolo proposed they attack Zara instead, to defer the debt.
Zara, Christian city on the Dalmatian coast. Venice's rival, also under the King of Hungary who'd taken the cross, Dandolo said. Help us take Zara. We postpone the debt for the trip east.
Pope Innocent forbade it.
Absolutely. Attacking a Christian city, whose king was a crusader. Unthinkable. Threatened excommunication. Some crusaders, like Simon of Montfort, refused, left.
But most felt trapped. Agreed.
Deeply in debt, needing transport, they reluctantly went along. Attacked and captured Zara, November 1202. Innocent excommunicated them all, though later absolved the truly repentant Franks. Venetian stayed excommunicated for longer.
And then it got even more complicated. The diversion to Constantinople.
While wintering near Zara, they were approached by Prince Alexius Angelos, son of a deposed Byzantine emperor. He wanted help getting his father back on the throne, offered an amazing deal: pay off their Venetian debt, provide troops and supplies for the Holy Land, and reunite the Greek and Latin churches under the Pope.
Another huge diversion, attacking the biggest Christian city in the world.
Exactly. But the Crusaders were broke, desperate. This offer seemed like a solution: money, supplies, plus the bonus of church unity the Pope wanted. Despite unease, the leaders, heavily influenced by the Venetians who had their own agenda against Byzantium, accepted.
The first attack in 1203 succeeded in restoring Alexius IV and his father.
Byzantines were numerous but poorly led. Crusaders, especially Venetians attacking the sea walls, got in. A huge fire accidentally started by Venetians caused massive damage. But Alexius IV was enthroned.
And the Crusaders were awestruck by Constantinople's wealth.
Totally blown away. The size, the palaces, the churches, and the relics. More than Rome and Jerusalem combined, they thought.
But Alexius IV couldn't deliver on his promises.
He paid enough to cover the Venice debt, but struggled to raise the rest. Taxing the city, melting church treasures, it made him incredibly unpopular. He was caught between the Crusaders outside and his angry subjects inside. Latin residents started fleeing to the Crusader camp.
Crusaders lost patience, demanded payment.
Sent a delegation, basically threatened war if he didn't pay up, inflamed tensions further. Early 1204, an anti-Western noble, Mortzuflus, seized power, had Alexius IV killed.
Leaving the Crusaders stranded, their deal gone, still broke.
Precisely. No reason to be there, no way to get to the Holy Land. They decided the only option was to conquer the city themselves. Justified it by calling the Byzantines traitors for killing their emperor, resisting church union, drew up a treaty to divide the spoils.
The second assault, April 1204.
Focused on the weaker harbor walls. First attempt failed. Second attempt, April 12th, succeeded. Wind changed. Small groups broke through a gate. Defense collapsed.
And then,
Yeah.
the sack of Constantinople.
Horrific. 3 days of uncontrolled looting, violence, destruction. Crusaders and Latin refugees ran wild. Greed, hatred, revenge. Oaths forgotten. Civilians attacked. Women violated. Churches desecrated.
Hagia Sophia.
Stripped bare. Altars smashed. Icons destroyed for gold and jewels. Drunkenness, sacrilege. Accounts from both sides are damning. Pope Innocent was appalled, said they'd bathed their swords in Christian blood.
And the Byzantine senator Nicetas Choniates.
Utterly devastated. Called the Crusaders hypocrites, trampling the cross for gold, judged the sack worse than Saladin's capture of Jerusalem, because these were Christians doing it, created centuries of bitterness, poisoned East-West relations permanently.
The disaster for Byzantium.
Huge. A Latin empire was set up, territory divided. Byzantines went into exile, eventually retook the city in 1261, but Constantinople never truly recovered, weakened it irrevocably.
A tragic deviation. But crusading wasn't just eastward. It became a tool in Europe, too.
Yes, the model vow, indulgence, privileges got applied closer to home. Not entirely new, think Charlemagne, but the formal crusade structure changed things.
Like the Reconquista in Spain and Portugal.
That long struggle, centuries old, against Muslim rulers there. Popes increasingly equated fighting in Iberia with crusading east, same spiritual rewards. Urban II encouraged fighting at Tarragona instead of going east. Battles like Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 were declared formal crusades.
And the Albigensian Crusade, 1209-1229, against Christians, the Cathars in southern France.
Catharism, a dualistic heresy, strong in Languedoc, especially among some nobles. Church struggled to preach it out. Local lords like Raymond of Toulouse were reluctant to crack down hard.
Innocent III tried preaching first.
Sent Cistercians, St. Dominic. Limited success. By 1204, he was already offering crusade indulgences for help suppressing it.
It escalated after papal legates were murdered.
Innocent blamed Raymond, declared a full crusade in 1208, same indulgences for Jerusalem, but often only 40 days service needed. Huge response from northern French knights' piety, plus the chance to grab land.
So it became a war of conquest.
Very much so. Led by Simon of Montfort, brutal campaign against southern lords, seizing lands accused of supporting heresy. Sieges, massacres like Béziers.
Raymond VI fought back.
Resisted, got excommunicated again. Simon conquered large areas, eventually drew in King Peter II of Aragon, whose vassals were being dispossessed.
Peter II, the hero of Las Navas de Tolosa, intervened.
Complained to the Pope that Simon was attacking loyal Catholics. Took Toulouse under protection, led to the Battle of Muret, 1213. Simon, though outnumbered, crushed Peter II, who died, and Raymond. Ended Aragonese influence, secured Simon's conquests, complex mix of religion and politics.
And amidst all this fervor, the bizarre Children's Crusade, 1212.
A strange mix of popular piety, frustration maybe that adults weren't retaking Jerusalem, mostly poor rural youth, Stephen of Cloyes in France claimed visions, Nicholas in Germany.
Believed their purity would succeed where armies failed.
Marched south, expecting miracles, maybe the seed apart. Didn't happen. Many probably defrauded, sold into slavery in North Africa. Tragic side effect of the intense religious atmosphere.
Okay, so moving into the 13th century, what's happening in the East, and how does crusading continue to adapt?
Crusader states are shrinking, politically weak, and the Teutonic Knights start shifting focus.
The German order, founded during the Third Crusade.
Yes. They got involved in Hungary briefly, then invited to Prussia by a Polish duke in the 1220s to fight pagans.
That became their main theater.
Completely. Got papal and imperial backing to rule conquered lands. Launched a brutal, centuries-long conquest and forced conversion campaign in the Baltic. Created their own powerful state there, using the Crusade model for European expansion.
Meanwhile, Pope Innocent III, before he died, planned the Fifth Crusade, 1217-1221, the modeled crusade.
His big plan after the Fourth Crusade fiasco. Quia mare. Mobilize everyone. Strategy. Attack Egypt, the source of Muslim power. Use it to bargain for Jerusalem.
They targeted Damietta in Egypt.
Long siege, 18 months. At one point, Sultan Al-Kamil offered a deal. Jerusalem and much of the kingdom back if the Crusaders left Egypt.
And the papal legate, Pelagius, refused.
He did. Big mistake. Many thought later. King John of Brienne wanted to accept. Pelagius held out, maybe expecting total victory. Francis of Assisi famously visited the Sultan during the siege, trying peaceful conversion. Shows different approaches coexisted.
After taking Damietta, they marched on Cairo, towards Mansoura.
Disastrous move, Pelagius insisted. Bad campsite choice near the Nile. Al-Kamil cut them off, flooded them out. Starvation, disease. Forced to surrender Damietta just to get out alive in 1221. Total failure, blamed heavily on Pelagius.
Then the very unusual crusade of Emperor Frederick II, 1228-1229, excommunicated emperor, goes crusading.
Frederick II, brilliant, controversial figure, promised to crusade for years, kept delaying, married the heiress of Jerusalem, claimed the kingship, finally sailed in 1228 after being excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX for delays.
And he got Jerusalem back through negotiation.
Primarily. He used his army as leverage, negotiated with Sultan Al-Kamil, who was busy fighting relatives. Al-Kamil had offered Jerusalem before. Now Frederick's presence was a useful distraction or threat.
Frederick marched to Jaffa, started rebuilding, putting pressure on.
Even the Templars and Hospitallers, reluctant to serve and excommunicate, eventually joined when orders were issued in God's name. Showed it was about the Holy Land, not just Frederick.
Leading to the Treaty of Jaffa, 1229.
Remarkable diplomacy. Got Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth back, plus a corridor to the coast. But, big caveats. Jerusalem's walls mostly dismantled. Muslims kept control of the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. 10-year truce.
Frederick crowned himself king in the Holy Sepulchre.
Controversial. Excommunicated, claiming throne over his own infant son, left acre to jeers and garbage being thrown at him. Locals weren't impressed.
How was the treaty viewed? Success or failure?
Mixed. Secular success, got holy sites back without fighting. Religious failure. Jerusalem was undefended, politically negotiated, shared religious control. Seemed like a betrayal of the ideal to many Christians and Muslims.
And the kingdom remained unstable after Frederick left.
Huge resistance to his authority, led by John of Ibelin. Civil war for years. Then, 1244, Jerusalem lost again.
This time to mercenaries.
Khwarezmian Turks, displaced by Mongols, took Jerusalem brutally. Then, at Laforbi, Frankish and allied Syrian Muslim forces were annihilated by Khwarezmians and Egyptians. Irreversible defeat. Wiped out the kingdom's field army, confined Franks to coastal cities.
Prompting the crusade of King Louis IX of France, St. Louis. The Seventh Crusade, 1248-1254.
Louis IX, deeply pious, powerful French king, took the cross after an illness. Meticulously planned, like the Fifth Crusade, targeted Egypt.
Captured Damietta again, 1249.
Initial success, but the march on Mansoura bogged down. Slow, costly disease. Louis refused to retreat, maybe hoping for Egyptian infighting. Ayyubids being replaced by Mamluks. Egyptians cut supplies, trapped them.
And Louis was captured.
Starvation, sickness, forced retreat. Louis captured 1250, ransomed later. Remarkably, he stayed in the East for years after release, not fighting much, but using his resources to rebuild fortifications in Acre and other coastal cities.
During this time, the Mongols appear. Big threat, maybe potential allies.
Mongols swept across Asia into the Middle East, caused chaos. Some Christians hoped for an alliance against Muslims. Pope Innocent IV sent envoys to the Great Khan way out in Mongolia in 1245. Response: submit to Mongol rule, no alliance. Mongols invaded Syria 1259.
But they were stopped by this new power in Egypt.
Yeah.
The Mamluks.
Mamluks, elite slave soldiers who'd seized power. Sultan Qutuz led them against the Mongols at Ain Jalut in Palestine, 1260. Decisive Mamluk victory. First time the Mongol tide was really stopped. Huge moment.
And a key Mamluk general from that battle, Baybars, took over.
Baybars, ruthless, brilliant general, overthrew Qutuz, dedicated his reign to eliminating the Franks entirely, systematic campaigns. Took Safa at 1266, massacred the garrison after promising safety, took Jaffa 1268, brutal sack. His stated goal, jihad, until no more Franks were made. Captured the mighty Crac de Chevalier in 1271, relentless pressure.
Yet St. Louis tried one more time. The Eighth Crusade, 1270.
Still driven by piety, against court advice, but influenced by his brother, Charles of Anjou, now King of Sicily, who wanted to attack Tunis for his own reasons. Louis agreed, maybe hoping to convert the ruler or use it as a stepping stone. Died of dysentery almost immediately after landing in Tunis, August 1270.
Prince Edward of England arrived after Louis died.
Edward, later Edward I, arrived in Acre 1271, sometimes called the Ninth Crusade. Situation desperate, small force. Skirmished a bit, but mainly negotiated a 10-year truce with Baybars in 1272. Bought some time. Headed home when his father died.
The final collapse came after that truce ended.
Baybar's successors, Qalawin then al-Ashraf, picked off the remaining cities. Tripoli fell 1289, the final stand. Acre, the capital, 1291.
A fierce siege.
Overwhelming Mamluk force. Determined defense, but the city fell in May 1291. Last holdouts were the Templars in their seaside fortress. Fought on, building collapsed, killing defenders and attackers. The end of the Frankish states in the Levant.
But the idea of crusading didn't die in 1291.
Not at all. It continued, evolved. The title King of Jerusalem passed to Cyprus. Cyprus became a base for later raids like Peter for Curse campaigns, though Cyprus itself declined later.
And the military orders, they survived.
Oh yes. Hospitallers moved to Rhodes, became a major naval power fighting Turks. Lost Rhodes 1522, got Malta from Emperor Charles V, became Knights of Malta, held off Suleiman in the Great Siege of 1565, fought at Lepanto 1571, kept their mission to the sick too. Teutonic Knights, as we said, focused entirely on the Baltic, built their state, eventually became secular Prussia.
So crusading continued, but the focus shifted to defending Europe from the Ottomans.
Exactly. Ottomans became the main threat. Popes still called Crusades, but now for survival, defense. Often ended badly. Nicopolis 1396, Varna 1444, Constantinople finally fell 1453, despite a heroic defense. Devastating blow.
Even into the 16th century, popes were still trying.
Pope Leo connects early 1500s, big plans for a pan-European crusade against Ottoman Sultan Selim I. Two armies, Emperor, French king, detailed logistics. Treaty of London 1518 meant to create peace in Europe for this crusade. Hope for Jerusalem again.
But politics got in the way again.
Rivalry between Emperor Charles V and Francis I of France killed it. Francis even allied with the Ottomans later. Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim's son, pushed deep into Europe. Belgrade, Rhodes, Mohacs, Siege of Vienna. Lepanto 1571 was a big naval win, but the Ottoman threat remained for centuries.
So the crusade idea persisted, adapted for hundreds of years. Which brings us to Madden's final key point. How are they remembered today? And how that differs from the scholarship.
Right. Modern memory, he argues, is heavily shaped by much later ideas, starting with the Enlightenment.
Enlightenment thinkers reason? Secularism saw crusades negatively. Fanaticism, intolerance.
Exactly. Religious wars seemed odious, barbaric compared to rational wars for national interest.
Then in the 19th century, Romanticism brought a different view.
A partial rehabilitation. Still critical, but admired the chivalry, heroism, perceived piety. Sir Walter Scott's novel, The Talisman, hugely influential here.
Scott's portrayal of Saladin
made Saladin the epitome of chivalry, tolerance, wisdom. Contrasted him with the barbaric crusaders like Richard. That image of the noble Saladin versus the crude Franks really stuck in the popular Western mind, often simplifying the reality of both sides.
20th century brought other views. Marxist.
Saw it through economics, greed, avarice, proto-colonialism. Dismissed religion as just a cover. Historians like Barraclough called them aggressive. Crusader states' colonial exploitation minimized the genuine spiritual drivers.
And Sir Stephen Runciman's history in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Hugely popular, shaped the modern view.
Runciman, brilliant writer. His narrative presented Crusaders as mostly simple barbarians destroying sophisticated cultures. His famous conclusion, a long act of intolerance. Hugely influential, even if later scholarship revised parts of it. That image remains powerful.
What about Muslim perspectives? Madden says they also evolved.
Fascinating. For centuries after 1291, Crusades weren't actually central to Muslim memory. Saladin was respected, But Baybars, who kicked out the Franks and beat the Mongols, was often the bigger folk hero.
But that changed in modern times.
Yes, late 19th century onwards, especially reacting to European colonialism. Crusades got revived, reinterpreted as the original Western aggression, linked to modern imperialism, blamed for current problems, poverty, instability, a powerful political narrative.
Used by leaders compared to Israel.
Sometimes used by dictators as modern Saladins defending against new crusaders. And yes, the comparison of Israel to a crusader state is common in some rhetoric, seeing the current conflict as a continuation. Madden quotes an Arab historian saying their condition is very close to ancestors facing crusades, so they must study them. Shows how alive this history feels in contemporary politics.
So the scholarly consensus Madden represents tries to cut through these later layers, get back to the medieval context.
That's the core argument. Understand them as medieval events driven by medieval motivations: faith, piety, penance, defense of Christians and holy sites. Motivations fundamentally different from modern ones. Whether they helped or hurt Byzantium is debated, but Madden argues they weren't primarily modern-style wars of conversion or colonial conquest, but acts of perceived defense and piety, however brutal they seem to us.
So wrapping up this deep dive into the concise history of the Crusades, what really stands out is, well, just how much more complex, diverse, and long-lasting this whole phenomenon was than the usual picture, and how its meaning keeps getting rewritten.
Absolutely. We've seen motivations rooted in a medieval faith we struggle to grasp, political deals crossing religious lines, crusading happening all over Europe, not just the East, and the stark contrast between the often brutal reality, the sack of Constantinople, Baybars massacres, and the romantic or politicized ways these events are remembered later.
So when you hear the Crusades mentioned today, news, politics, movies, maybe you remember this dive. Remember, the medieval world was different. Its people had different reasons. And how we remember history often says as much about us now as about the past itself.
And maybe here's something to chew on. Given how much the interpretation of the Crusades has shifted based on the needs and biases of different eras, how might our own 21st century challenges our views on religion, human rights, geopolitics, everything, be shaping how we understand and talk about these incredibly complex events today?
A question worth wrestling with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.